Your Majesty, Your Royal Highness, ladies and gentlemen, and dear friends of the children's right and business community. My name is Ruben Brunsveld, and I'd like to welcome you here to the Global Child Forum 3rd Digital Action Lab, which is taking place under the name A Collapsing Planet, the Impact of Climate Change on Children's Health. We have an amazing lineup of speakers for you today, as we've had in the previous Digital Action Labs. I really look forward to interacting with the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Environment, Vice President of Global Corporate Affairs of Astrazeneca, Director of Sustainable Development Goals at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and again, a youth activist. But before we go there, we are so honored again to have the engagement of the Royal House with us. And today that is embodied by Her Royal Highness Crown Princess Victoria, who will address you and open this 3rd Digital Action Lab.
Your Majesties, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce this 3rd Action Lab in Global Child Forum's Action Lab series. This Action Lab, focusing on climate change and the impact on children, is especially timely and urgent. Around the world, children's rights are suffering a severe setback due to the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. At the same time, we are in a state of environmental emergency that is threatening children's prospects for a healthy and prosperous future. Rising sea levels, severe weather events, drought, forest fires, and flooding, widespread pollution of air, water, and soil, exposure to toxic substances, loss of biodiversity. All of these things put children at risk for birth defects, failing health, and child mortality, for conflict, poverty, and child labor. In fact, each year, more than 1.7 million children under the age of 5 die as a result of avoidable environmental degradation. 1.7 million. That is 3 children every minute whose lives could have been saved. And millions more suffer consequences of climate change, such as disease, disability, and other forms of harm. At this rate, our current climate crisis will make every one of the Sustainable Development Goals less achievable, slowing efforts to eradicate poverty, improve health, and protect the environment. The effects of this growing crisis are far-reaching and interrelated. Climate change is no longer just an environmental issue. It is something that requires collective commitment from all parts of society, especially the business sector. Because what businesses do, and also what they don't do, have enormous impact on children and youth. In 2018, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment recommended that businesses conduct environmental and human rights impact assessments viewed through a children's rights lens. The Special Rapporteur identified climate change as a global concern disproportionately affecting children, echoing a United Nations Human Rights Council resolution that recognized children as among the most vulnerable to climate change. Today, we will hear from David Boyd, the current Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. So, how will businesses respond? That is up to you. What is certain, however, is that inaction is not an option. Once again, a warm welcome to today's Action Lab.
Thank you very much for these wise and important words, which give us such a sense of urgency but also a clear call to action. We very much appreciate the engagement and commitment of the Royal House, which today is also illustrated by the fact that Her Royal Highness will be with us throughout this session. And with that, we will move into our first guest of the day, which Her Royal Highness already also mentioned, Dr. David Boyd, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. The second UN Special Rapporteur on this topic, specially dedicated, and we're very honored to have him with us. David.
Well, thank you very much, Ruben, and thank you for those opening words, Her Royal Highness. Very powerful, very compelling. And you know, friends and colleagues, we live on the only planet in the universe that is known to support life, this beautiful blue-green Earth. And yet humans are inflicting calamitous harm on this beautiful planet that we call home. The climate emergency, of course, is one key element of that, and we are seeing everything that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has predicted over the last 25 years is already starting to occur right across the world, whether we're talking about increased precipitation that leads to flooding, increased intensity of tropical storms, more severe droughts, more severe heat waves and wildfires. You know, this year alone, we've seen vicious fires in Australia, the United States. I live on the west coast of Canada, and earlier this summer, where I live, we had the worst air quality on Earth because of the wildfires in the United States. But it's not simply the global climate emergency. As Her Royal Highness indicated, we face this interlocking set of environmental challenges, which includes the decline in biological diversity. I mean, the fact that rates of extinction are hundreds of times higher than normal, and 1 million species are at risk of extinction. Air pollution kills 7 million people prematurely every year, including 600,000 children under the age of 5. And that figure also includes hundreds of thousands of newborn children who, because of air pollution, die within the first life of their month. And for those of us who are parents, it's almost unimaginable to think of the pain of losing a newborn child. And then the fourth element of the global environmental emergency is the rise in emerging infectious diseases, 70% of which are zoonoses. These are diseases that are transmitted from other species, sometimes through the bridge of livestock, but sometimes directly from wildlife to humans. COVID-19, which has had terrible impacts on people all across the planet, but particularly children, is simply the latest of these. Other examples include the Ebola virus, Nipah virus, Marburg virus, HIV/AIDS, and avian influenza. And all four of these environmental challenges are linked to the way that we interact with the rest of the natural world. You know, it's interesting to reflect on the fact that humans actually share DNA, the basic building block of life, with every other form of life. So we need to begin treating nature as a community to which we are fortunate to belong, rather than a commodity which is here simply for humans to exploit. There is no question that climate change has devastating impacts upon the health and well-being of children. Children are particularly vulnerable for physical and psychological reasons. Physically, they're smaller, they breathe more rapidly, their organs are still developing, so they have less ability to deal with processing of toxic chemicals. They're vulnerable to things such as respiratory diseases, malnutrition, diarrhea, and other waterborne illnesses. And if we look at what's happening already because of climate change, we're already seeing things like the increased marriage of young girls because their families are facing food insecurity, and that's happening in Africa and Asia. And if we look at the state of children around the world, the future of climate change is really disturbing, because climate change at its heart is a risk multiplier. So it increases the risk of heat stress, of poor air quality, of vector-borne diseases, of food and water insecurity. The World Health Organization estimates that by 2030, the impacts of climate change on nutrition will result in an additional 7.5 million children who are moderately or severely stunted. By 2040, almost 600 million children will live in regions with extremely limited water resources. Today, Over 500 million children live in extreme high-risk flood zones. 160 million children live in high or extremely high drought severity zones. And 115 million children are at high risk from tropical cyclones. Now, I want to put this in a bit of a personal context. In my work as the special rapporteur, I have done missions to countries including Fiji, Norway, and Kenya, and I have witnessed firsthand the impacts of climate change upon children. In Fiji, I met with a group of children in a meeting organized by UNICEF, and I'll never forget talking to an 11-year-old girl named Akisi, who said that her family used to have picnics on the beach near where she lives, but now because of rising sea levels, storm surges, and her memories of the tropical cyclone Winston that hit Fiji hard in 2016, she's afraid of the ocean. And that, for a young child to be afraid of the ocean is a truly sad and sorrowful thing. In Norway, I spent time with the Sami indigenous people, and I spoke to young reindeer herders. And reindeer herding is at the heart of the Sami culture, the heart of their economy. And because of climate change, the reindeer are literally starving to death during the winter, because instead of having snow that they can scrape away with their hoofs, they're getting a mixture of snow and rain, which forms ice, and the reindeer simply cannot get at the mosses and lichens. And so these young people in northern Norway are fearful for the future of their culture. But it's not all doom and gloom. And I think it's really important to highlight this. Children have rights. They have rights at the global level under the Convention on the Rights of the Child. They have rights at the regional level under regional agreements like the European Convention on Human Rights and the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. And they have rights at the national level under constitutions. And young people around the world are taking these rights and they're using them to protect their health and protect their future. At the global level, there's a group of 16 children and youth who have filed a lawsuit that's currently sitting before the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child. There's a group of Portuguese children who filed a case against 33 countries at the European Court of Human Rights. And I want to tell you a story of 25 children and youth from Colombia who filed a lawsuit in 2018 arguing that deforestation in the Colombian portion of the Amazon, which has huge implications for global climate change, these young people argued that deforestation was a violation of their constitutional right to live in a healthy environment. And they took that case to the Supreme Court of Colombia, and they won a resounding victory where the Supreme Court said, yes, deforestation and the impacts on climate change definitely violate your right to a healthy environment. And therefore, the government must sit down with you and the country's leading scientists and come up with a plan to rapidly end deforestation. There are cases all around the world, in the United States, in Canada, in India, Pakistan, all over the world, where children are using their rights to fight for a cleaner, greener, healthier future. And it's not just in the courts. Children are obviously taking to the streets in the millions before the COVID-19 pandemic. And just a couple of weeks ago, I met a young man from China who's developed an app to address the problem of food waste. And this young fellow has already got more than 2 million subscribers to his app, which he estimates will prevent millions of tons of greenhouse gas emissions. So although children face existential threats because of the global environmental emergency, they are also at the forefront of finding innovative and creative solutions and fighting for their right to live in a healthy environment. And I think it's absolutely critical that business join hands, join forces with young people to move forward, to solve these challenges. We know we have the solutions. It's simply a matter of implementing them. Thank you, and I look forward to our panel session.
Thank you very much, David. And you will be back in our panel. But for now, thank you for this passionate plea in which you took up already so many important things that we can continue our discussion in the panel with. You also referred to young people that are coming as plaintiffs in front of the court to challenge with legal measures the status quo, and to challenge also states in their acting or sometimes in their non-acting when it comes to climate change. And we have with us today here one of these young people, a climate activist called Lauren Wright from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. I've been waiting to say those two words in a row, Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. And Lauren was one of a group of 15 young people who brought a case La Rose versus Her Majesty the Queen, in which you're fighting for, well, simply said, a better future. Lauren, welcome.
Hello, yes, and thank you for having me today. My name is Lauren Wright. I'm 16 years old, and I live in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Canada, which is the traditional territory of the Cree, Blackfoot Sioux peoples, as well as the homeland of the Métis. As Ruben mentioned, I am one of the 15 young people suing the government of Canada for their contributions to and lack of action to address the climate crisis. The plaintiffs in our case come from across Canada, and we are aged 11 to 19 years old. Our case is based on the fact that the federal government has violated our rights under Section 7 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which outlines the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. We are also including the violation of the public trust doctrine, which guarantees the protection and preservation of natural resources like the permafrost, the air, and the oceans. We launched our case in 2019, and we had our first hearing at the end of September. The judge did not rule in the way that we had hoped, and he chose to strike our claims and grant the Government of Canada's motion to strike. However, this is far from the end of our case, and we are moving to appeal the decision, and we will continue fighting for our rights from here. Each individual child has experienced different impacts to their health caused by climate change. My story is just one of the stories out of the estimated 1.9 billion children that live on this planet. Many of the impacts to my physical health are rooted in the place that I live, Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan has a reputation for erratic temperatures and long, frigid winters. For me, these winters are a source of massive pain because I have something that's called Raynaud syndrome. And Raynaud syndrome basically means that in cold temperatures, the blood flow to my hands and feet is severely restricted or cut off. Living in a place where winter lasts for 5 or 6 months out of the year and temperatures are regularly below negative 45 degrees Celsius results in months of pain and suffering. As the climate crisis worsens too, we're seeing that our winters are becoming longer and our temperatures are becoming more extreme and erratic. At the same time, our summers are becoming hotter and I'm dealing with heat strokes, severe sunburns, and an increased risk of skin cancer. I have dealt with flooding, blizzards, extreme storms, torrential winds, and droughts, all of which endanger me. My fellow plaintiffs live with things like asthma, Lyme disease, and wildfire-related problems. These are all exacerbated by changes to temperature and an increase in severe weather and natural disasters that are caused by climate change. One of the areas that I find is often quite neglected in a projection of health is mental health and psychological well-being. For so long, the idea of being healthy has revolved around being physically well. We know that mental health is a very real concern and that it can have a tremendous impact on an individual's well-being. For me personally, the climate crisis has had a devastating impact on my mental health. I live with generalized anxiety disorder and clinical depression. For my entire life, I have lived on a planet with an expiration date. I have never had the luxury of a guaranteed future where I'm able to live and grow up on a planet that is healthy and that can sustain me. This has brought crippling anxiety and depression to countless young people, myself included. We are being forced to sit and watch as our future is sold. We have been forced to sacrifice our childhoods in order to have a chance at a future. It seems that no matter how loud we yell, no one is listening. This brings a sense of overwhelming hopelessness. I feel constant anxiety over the targets that we miss, the inaction from our elected officials, and the knowledge that we only have so long before we pass a point of no return for our planet. Children and young people are the ones who are suffering the most from climate change, despite contributing the least to it. Climate change is not some far-off issue that will be dealt with years in the future. It is having real and devastating impacts on those of us with the least power. We are suffering now, and we know that the climate crisis isn't going anywhere with our current actions. Young people continue to call for those in power to use their privilege to fight the climate crisis and give us a shot at a healthy and safe future. Today, I ask the same of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lauren. And I must say, it's impressive to hear you speak. Many of the effects that you just mentioned, I read also in the legal documents of the case, where you as a plaintiff had to outline the effects that it had on you. But to hear you vocalize in your own words the effect that climate change has on you and your family is incredibly impressive. Thank you for being with us today, and we hope that we can come back to you perhaps later during the seminar. With that, we go to our third speaker, and later in this session today, you will have an opportunity to also go into subgroups with the speakers. So make sure that you all pay good attention to each speaker so you know kind of what their background is and which subgroup you would like to go into. But for now, we're going to move over to our third speaker, which is Richard Buckley, Vice President Global Corporate Affairs from Astrazeneca. Richard, where are you coming in from?
Thank you so much. I'm here in Gaithersburg, Maryland, right outside of Washington, D.C.
Welcome.
Thank you so much. I am, like you, I'm incredibly humbled and hopeful to follow Lauren. Thank you so much for your comments, Lauren. I wanted to share a few things today about the role that AstraZeneca is playing in this particular topic. So at AstraZeneca, we think about healthcare along a really broad spectrum, from wellness and prevention through to screenings, if necessary, a diagnosis, treatment, medicines, recovery, and then hopefully back to wellness and prevention. But we think about that really broadly, and we also think about at the beginning and end and throughout that entire spectrum of not just a person being healthy, but also our planet being healthy. And we know that as climate change worsens, the impact will fall disproportionately on vulnerable populations and in particular on children, as we have seen. So I wanted to call out a few of the activities that we're engaged in here today. And as you said, we can talk more about it at the panel and in the breakout. So the first thing I wanted to mention was, as a company, we have taken one of the boldest postures as it relates to carbon. So our zero carbon strategy is that we committed to zero carbon emissions by 2025 and carbon negative value chain by 2030. Right. So, and we're going to do that without using any kind of offsetting schemes. That'll be about emissions, and then throughout our entire chain, using things like electric fleets for our cars, environmentally friendly inhalers, and many renewable energy and many other measures. We've committed to over $1 billion to meet that very ambitious strategy by 2030, and we're already well underway. Another thing that we've done as a company is we've committed to plant 50 million trees. The first trees went into the ground over the next 5 years. The first trees went into the ground earlier this year in Australia, with more to come in France and Indonesia, and throughout the rest of the world thereafter. And this is all also in accordance with the World Economic Forum's 1 trillion trees platform. So two kind of big macro initiatives that our company has undertaken, and a little bit, as I said, a little bit counterintuitive, pharmaceutical companies being so strong in those kinds of initiatives. Often our philanthropy is in other places as a sector. But as I said, we believe very strongly that for people to be healthy, our planet has to be healthy, and happy to take the lead here and ask other companies to follow. The third thing I'd like to call out is really our crown jewel, which is our Young Health Program. And this is our program to reduce NCDs through prevention and wellness, particularly among young people. And we do that by mobilizing young people. Think of an army of Laurens worldwide, and through their efforts, research, advocacy, leadership, and mentorship in their particular communities and in their countries, to make themselves and their communities healthier. One of the first things we did when we launched the program was work with Johns Hopkins to launch a study called WAVE, Well-Being of Adolescents in Vulnerable Environments. And we asked youth what were those things that they thought we needed to work on to increase the health of themselves and their communities. And at the top of that list was environmental degradation and ensuring that they had access to clean air and clean water in their communities. So that kind of programming has been present in our Young Health program throughout, and we're operating in more than 30 countries worldwide, and we've worked with over 4 million kids since 2010. We're doing lots of cool things. I won't get into it now. We're probably running low on time, but really cool things at the local level, India and Indonesia and Kenya and other places around the world, making real measurable change on the ground, both in the area of environmental degradation as well as broader NCD wellness and prevention initiatives. So I'll just close by saying I like what David said about business joining forces with young people. To me, that's really at the core of our Young Health program and our other corporate commitments. There's a lot of areas that I'm proud of for AstraZeneca, living its culture and its values, but few, I think, more powerful than what we're doing in order to align and ally ourselves with young people on their own behalf to improve their health and well. With that, I'll turn it back over to you and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Richard, for those first introductory remarks and for showing us the angle that you have and which AstraZeneca is taking in this debate. From that, we move on to another person who will be joining us in the upcoming panel, but will introduce himself now, and that's James Gome, Director Sustainable Development Goals of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Welcome to our Digital Action Lab, James.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for getting through my lengthy title as well. Director of SDGs at the WBCSD. It's slightly shorter. But yeah, no, it's a pleasure to be here, and like Richard, just wanted to echo how humbling it was to have those opening comments from Lauren, who spoke so eloquently. I think back to myself at the age of 16, and there's no way I would be able to voice such sophisticated opinions in such a compelling way. And so it's great that we have young leaders like Lauren acting and looking at these issues, but in a way it's so tragic that they have to. And that's the real thing that we have to try and address, and something that my organization is trying to advance through engaging with the business community. So just to introduce my organization, WBCSD is a membership organization of around 200 multinational businesses. And these companies join WBCSD to really help them do collectively what they're struggling to do individually, and to accelerate the transition to a more sustainable future, to a world hopefully in 2050 where 9+ billion people are all living well, but also within planetary boundaries as we know them today. We cover pretty much every industry imaginable, from energy through to healthcare, food, construction, mobility, etc. And we also work with a network of partners from around 60 different countries, amplifying our messages at the SME level around the world as well. So what we do, we bring all of these companies together in a pre-competitive space to discuss solutions to some of the key issues we're looking at. And we focus those efforts around a series of key economic systems. We focus predominantly around cities and mobility, around the food system, around the energy system, around finance, and also around the circular economy. And across all of these areas, there's a lot of different activities going on, but really we've boiled it down to 3 key priorities for our work over the next decade, looking at all of the sustainable development goals, but boiling it down to 3 issues, which is addressing the climate emergency, tackling the crisis facing our natural world, as David was alluding to earlier, and then also tackling inequality in our society, whether that takes the form of human rights violations or other forms of inequality that are becoming increasingly rife and leading to more societal unrest. So we support business in a number of ways to tackle these issues. We developed, together with businesses, we developed tools for helping specific businesses move towards a more sustainable future. We help to set standards. You may be familiar with the greenhouse gas protocol. Originally was developed within WBCSD some decades ago. We develop knowledge sharing platforms where companies can share best practice and develop guidelines to be shared with the business community more broadly. We do some advocacy, so positioning key policy asks for what the business community needs to be able to advance specific sustainable business solutions. And then we build coalitions, convening platforms from across value chains, across sectors, across public and private sector, to try and advance awareness and drive impact. And very pleased to be working with the Global Child Forum and look forward to other opportunities to do so in the future as part of our coalition building efforts. On climate specifically, we're doing a lot of work to help our members transition to a net zero by 2050. This cuts across a range of different industries and areas, whether it's from power generation, transport, agriculture, industrial activity, buildings, et cetera. And we're working to advance a number of different projects in this area. We have a large project called SOS 1.5, which is a big document which really helps to get net zero ambitions implemented for companies, and work provides a framework for that to happen in a logical and step-by-step way. We have an energy solutions group which looks to build cross-sector collaboration across the energy value chain to help companies source renewably, and for power companies to provide the renewable power that there is now demand for. We look at supporting low carbon mobility solutions across the mobility system. We're developing science-based targets for the built environment, helping companies develop their own climate smart agriculture practices, and also now working very much on the carbon natural climate solutions side of things, looking at how the natural climate solutions space can be more substantially developed to help provide solutions where emissions abatement is not yet possible. So lots of different activities going on, but very important to realize as well that all of these climate related issues are not addressed in isolation as well. We need to look holistically at the SDGs and use the Sustainable Development Goals as a North Star for all our efforts, and understand how a particular solution in one area could cause problems in other areas, whether it's potential for human rights violations along long materials value chains, or whether it's water scarcity or whatever. This is a very complex agenda with lots of ins and outs, so we have to be aware of how our action affects others and ensure that there's a transition to a net zero world, but a just transition, and a transition that also fosters and nurtures our natural world as well. So generally, I would say that companies in our membership are on board with this, which gives us great cause for hope. We're seeing every day more net zero announcements come out from different companies. I think I saw three just today. So it's great to see that the drive is now there from the business community, and it's up to us to continue to get more companies on board and expand beyond our 200 member companies, so that the entire business community is on board and using its powers of innovation to take us to a world where 9 billion people can live well within planetary boundaries by 2050. I think the next 10 years is a critical, unique window to do so. We have 10 years left, less than 10 years. So now is really the time to act. It's a time of huge disruption, but that also brings with it time for opportunities and a chance to reset some of the key systems that are going to help to drive us towards the future we want. So that's a quick overview of what we're up to at WBCSD, and I look forward to discussing more. Thanks.
Thank you very much to the DSG WBCSD. Yeah, so gentlemen, we're going to go into a bit of a panel discussion here for the coming 15 minutes or so. And my first question would be that James, you spoke about the fact that nothing takes place in isolation, and also David, you spoke about the interlocking set of environmental challenges. However, if we look at the verdict of the court that in the case that Lauren was involved with, one of the reasons that it did not have a successful outcome for her was that the court exactly said that it was overly broad and unquantifiable number of actions that were necessary on the part of the state, and that it was also an undue breadth and diffuse nature of conduct that we're talking about. In other words, it's almost so much that we can't really expect that, and we don't really know what we're talking about. Is that sometimes the problem with climate change, that it's too overwhelming, and when we're talking about everything, then we're talking about nothing?
Well, Ruben, I would just say that this decision, if you look at it in a global context, is actually an outlier. And there's two factors here. One is that Canada is among a minority of countries globally that does not recognize the fundamental right to live in a healthy environment. This is a right that's recognized by over 80% of the countries in the world. There are only 37 holdouts, which do unfortunately include Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, China, Japan, and a host of other countries. The second thing that makes this case an outlier is that it's not consistent with court decisions in many other countries around the world. I mentioned the decision in Colombia, where the Supreme Court of Colombia said very clearly that the government has an obligation to terminate deforestation. There's also a terrific decision from the Supreme Court of the Netherlands in a climate change case called the Urgenda case, where a group of citizens brought a case arguing that the actions of the Dutch government to address the global climate emergency were simply too feeble. It's not ambitious enough. And the court didn't tell the government precisely what to do. The court simply said, you must reduce emissions more quickly and more deeply. And so I think that's the role of courts, is to really hold governments accountable to their environmental commitments, to their human rights commitments. And I think that that's what hopefully will happen when Lauren's case goes on appeal to the Federal Court of Appeal in Canada.
Because before I go over to the other two panelists, one follow-up question on that: is there enough conceptual certainty about what is meant with the right to life in a healthy and sustainable environment?
Absolutely. The fact is that the right to a healthy environment has been recognized by some countries for more than 40 years. You know, Portugal was the first country to put it in its constitution back in 1976, followed by Spain in 1978. So we have 155 countries with varying degrees of experience with the right to a healthy environment, dating back decades. My reports to the United Nations General Assembly and the Human Rights Council are, I've produced a series of reports on clean air as an element of the right to a healthy environment, on a safe climate as an element of the right to a healthy environment, on healthy ecosystems, and I'm currently working on a report on water as part of that right to a healthy environment. So there's quite a bit of conceptual clarity. I think one thing I'd like to point out at this point in the conversation is that we're focused today on the rights of children and youth, and the world's the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which was negotiated back in the 1980s, is a global agreement. Every country in the world except the United States is a party to this agreement, and it does not include the right to a healthy environment. So I think that's one of the key action items that we have on our agenda moving forward. We need to amend the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child to recognize that every single child, no matter where they live, no matter whether they're rich or poor, no matter the color of their skin, has a right to a healthy environment that's protected by the Convention on the Rights of the Child.
Thank you, David, for giving us that framework and kind of international public law framework. But then we move to the business side of things, and then I come also to Richard and James. When we talk with businesses about business and human rights or children's rights, we often start off with the concept of do no harm. Right? You have to look at your own impact as a business and first rule is make sure that you do no harm. Is that still good enough?
I can go first if you like. I would say no. I mean, that's been a tenet of the sustainability movement, I think, for the last few decades. And I think really the term sustainability, if you like, is no longer fit for purpose, in that we need to be moving to a much more regenerative mindset as we're looking at a lot of these issues. And if we're looking at it from an environmental perspective, damage has already been done. We are transgressing a number of planetary boundaries. I think on the climate side, 8 out of 15 boundaries are currently in overshoot. If we're going to get back to being within planetary boundaries, we have to restore and nurture the capacity of systems to regenerate themselves rather than just halting the bad behavior. I think the same also now applies on the social side. in terms of regenerating the key facets of our society in order to be able to nourish our populations and our society. So I think do no harm is still critically important, and we mustn't get away from do no harm, because that is the baseline. But we have to be moving beyond that, I think, to a more regenerative mindset.
Yeah, I would certainly agree. I think this kind of enters the debate and conversation about stakeholder capitalism. I think do no harm is a good place to start, but I think there's an expectation among the public and external constituencies and our own employees that we do more than that. And so I think that's at the heart of some of the initiatives that I've spoken about here today, as well as others. I think there's a justifiable public expectation that we do more than do no harm.
That's a very interesting point that you bring up there, Richard. The stakeholder perspective. Is that one of the things that has driven you at AstraZeneca strongly to move beyond do no harm and go into a net positive impact? Is that stakeholder driven?
Honestly, I would advise other corporate affairs, public affairs officials at their companies not to necessarily begin with that presumption of trying to chase a reputation or trying to build equity with external stakeholders. I think it's better to be much more authentic about it and to do the right things that are consistent with your company culture. And thinking about environmental degradation, thinking about reducing carbon came about as a result of a company-wide conversation we had as we were rethinking our corporate strategy. And a lot of different employees kind of put their hand up and said, we need to be doing more here. And that really resonated with our CEO and with our senior leadership. And that really was the genesis of these programs. It wasn't trying to build equity with external stakeholders necessarily, but certainly we found that to be the case. And these initiatives were well received. But I think for them to be effective and enduring, they have to be authentic, and these initiatives felt really authentic to our corporate values.
I think that's a very important word and term you're using there in terms of authenticity. Have you seen, James, a development in that sense in your global business community, that there has been a move towards more an internal drive and authenticity when it comes to, well, maybe even this regenerative culture, as you called it?
Yeah, no, I think so, definitely. In terms of what we did a survey earlier this year of the younger populations of our member companies. So looking at the sort of the new joiners, the employees who just come into the company in their early 20s, and what their expectations were for the company in terms of sustainability practice. And all of them voted sustainable strategy of the company's ability to communicate around these issues as one of the key components that drove a feeling of pride in working for that organization. And anecdotally, we've started to hear from a lot of industries who perhaps have the image of being unsustainable or tied to products that are not compatible necessarily with a 1.5 degree world, struggling to attract new talent in the ways that they were able to do so previously. So I think it's a key requirement for talent acquisition now, as you're bringing in that next generation of people who are going to run the company for you, if you're around in the coming decades. So yeah, key issues and key ways of thinking around how to actually attract and engage with your staff.
In that sense, there is a business incentive built into that authenticity as well. David, can I ask you, from your point of view at the UN, there is much more happening in the world of business and human rights also at the UN level. We've seen in the last decade the UN guiding principles being developed and being implemented, and moving from perhaps very soft law towards being integrated into more hard law in different companies. Is that a development you see continuing, or how do you see the UNGPs developing in the coming years?
Yeah, Ruben, so thanks for that question. And so in my role as the UN Special Rapporteur, I literally get contacted every single day by people in different regions of the world whose rights are being violated by the activities of businesses in their communities, whether that's an open pit coal mine beside an indigenous community in Colombia, whether that's coal-fired power plants in South Africa. This is something that is happening today despite the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights. And so I'm actually a very firm believer that we need to evolve towards a much more stricter and regulatory system. I mean, it's great. There are companies like Astrazeneca, like, as Richard has described, that are doing great things, but there are still far too many companies that are continuing to inflict huge environmental damage and violate human rights. And so I'm encouraged by the fact that France, for example, has passed a new law requiring due diligence from French businesses up and down the supply chain. I'm encouraged that the European Union is considering a similar type of legislative approach. And I think that we have to make a system where the law requires businesses to do human rights and environmental due diligence, because the optional voluntary system is simply not fit for purpose.
James, any thoughts? Because you're doing great work, but all this voluntary approach is not working, we're hearing. Should we go towards more mandatory regulation?
Yeah, I think that's going to have to happen at some stage. As David was saying, I think there are gaps in the current system, and the ideal is to move towards closing those gaps. And if regulation can be brought in that helps to do that, I think that's definitely a positive. I think what we're seeing is a lot of there has been a big change over the last 5 years or so. If you were to ask companies before, do you have human rights violations in your supply chain, there would be a blanket wall put up. Everyone would say no, and they would call the legal department and panic. Whereas I think now there is a general acceptance by all companies that they do have human rights issues in their supply chain that need looking at. And I think that's the first step, is to say, look, there are areas of our supply chain that we don't have visibility on, but looking at the numbers we're hearing, so 40 million people in some form of forced labor, 150 million cases of child labor globally, there must be instances in your supply chain of that happening. And companies are now recognizing those blind spots and trying to engage in multi-stakeholder collaborations and business-to-business collaborations to try and address a lot of those issues. But there's still no way of entirely closing that gap at the moment. There are still issues that need to be addressed. And if new regulations can come in that can help to facilitate and accelerate that process, I think business would welcome that in many cases.
Yeah, but I think that's one of the challenges, though, is because these human rights violations, anybody who can see that there is ongoing environmental degradation in our world. 100 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions are released every single day. And while there are leaders in the business community, the problem is that when we go to governments and we say governments need to regulate business activities to prevent human rights violations and prevent environmental degradation, it's the businesses themselves that are opposing regulation all around the world, in Canada, in the European Union, in Latin America, in Africa. And so we need to get to a place where progressive businesses are actually saying to governments, we need to sit down and we need to develop regulations that will hold us accountable, that are not, just useless red tape, but that are effective in protecting the environment and protecting human rights. And we need to get businesses on side with that instead of fighting that, which has been the case for the last 3 decades.
Richard, the final word then is yours, because I think we've seen, for instance, on this topic of mandatory human rights due diligence, that some businesses have supported that because it might level out the playing field. Do you have a final thought on that?
I think that it's also very effective to get companies to get there on their own as well. So I think you can use a carrot and stick approach. Our CEO said when we launched our Carbon Zero program earlier this year, this is one of those places where we're not trying to be competitive with the other companies, actually calling on the other CEOs and the other companies to join with us in establishing very aggressive and progressive carbon zero targets. And so we've been using some soft diplomacy, if you will, as well. So I think it's both. I think there's probably both a carrot and stick approach that can help us get to where we need to go.
Okay, thank you very, very much for that. Right now, we're going to go into some breakout sessions, which will give our participants to this seminar the possibility to interact with you and then go a level deeper. So in the chat, which you find in your screen, there have been 3 links posted. The first one is a breakout group with Richard, which is called The Children's Health on a Warming Planet. The second one will be a breakout group with James, which is partnering for the goals 2020-2030. And the third one will be a breakout group with David Boyd and Lauren Wright on amplifying the voice of the youth. So you can go into the chat and click on one of the 3 breakout groups. If you do not get into a breakout session, but you get kind of lost in cyberspace, then please come back to this main session, and there will be somebody here on the technical side to support you and hopefully help you come to a breakout room. But right now, we invite all our participants to go to the chat and click on one of the 3 links in order to join one of the breakout groups. Well, that was way too short time in the breakup groups, as always, been such inspirational discussions and such inspirational guests. But nonetheless, a very good opportunity to go a level deeper and have a bit more intimate discussions. So I'm really looking forward to hear also what's been discussed in the other 2 groups. So can I ask you, Richard, to give us a little bit of a peek in what was discussed in your group and what your takeaway of this breakout group is?
Yeah, thank you so much. We had a great conversation, and I think it had to do, if there was a unifying theme, about the importance of partnership. So we talked about, for us, institutional partners like Plan International and UNICEF are critical to us connecting our corporate goals with action on the ground, but then also the importance of partnership with those communities themselves. That if you want to affect real change, you need to be working in concert with local government, churches, schools, in families in toto to drive real change. So it's good for a company to have a great intent, but without collaboration and partnership, you're unlikely to be successful.
Thank you very much for that clear message. James, what was said in your group?
Sure. Yeah. No. We had some interesting discussions, which as always seemed very short. But I think we touched on 2 important issues. There were some examples of best practice in terms of sustainability embedding into corporate strategy from someone who was kind enough to share Microsoft's perspective and voicing incredulity almost that some companies are still not doing these things, and unfortunately had to break the news that quite a lot of companies are not doing these things, and that we need to figure out ways to do that, potentially leveraging this growing desire to make changes to our capital markets system or our financial system, moving towards the stakeholder capitalism idea, how that can be leveraged to make some changes. And then we also spoke a little bit about how we could adapt the SDGs, applying a child-specific lens and extrapolate that and create potentially a to-do list for business or expectations for business from a child perspective, taking inspiration from the SDGs and how that would be a powerful tool to really lay out a series of actions and expectations for the business community in this field that could really help to clarify where they can have the most impact in this area. So that was it.
Thank you very much. And if we have a few more minutes, I think it would be an interesting one to come back to also to say, okay, so what is it that's at this moment still preventing companies from taking that steps? Why are some companies doing it and why are others still lagging? But before we go there, David, and Lauren, your main takeaways from this session.
Well, I'll jump in and say, I think there was really 2 key messages. One is that we absolutely have to accelerate action to address these interlocked global environmental challenges of climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, and prevent future pandemics. And the second is that one of the keys to doing that is to really listen to the voices of youth, amplify those voices, and find ways that youth can meaningfully engage in decision making. I think there has been progress in recent years in in listening to youth, but not on acting upon their advice. And I think that it's really important that we also hear from Lauren about her perspectives on this.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, there was definitely a large emphasis on the importance of accelerating the process of having youth represented in all sorts of decision-making circles, especially in decision-making circles around our future. A lot of the frustration that I, as well as other young people, have is we feel that everything's moving too slow despite all the work that we're putting in, and that things like the fact that we are unable to vote, so having election cycles come and go without our input, things like legal action taking years and years to go through, that all of these are not happening at a rate that is consistent with what we need to have a livable future and a future where we're all healthy and safe. So that's a frustration that I, as a young person, am having, and that a lot of other young people are experiencing, and really wanting to make sure that our voices are centered in making decisions about our future, and ensuring that we have a role to play and that our experiences are brought to the table when we're having those discussions.
Thank you very much. So we see a question coming up in the chat from Jenny Lindén, who says to Dr. David Boyd a question: what can businesses do to increase pressure to include the right to a healthy environment?
Yeah, I think this would be terrifically helpful. In September, 1,000 civil society organizations from more than 100 countries around the world wrote a joint letter to the United Nations saying that the time is now for the United Nations to finally recognize that everyone has the right to live in a healthy environment. And that pressure from civil society is helpful. It would be incredibly helpful to have a similar letter from the global business community, whether that's on the letterhead of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, or whether that's a coalition of businesses led by progressive leaders like AstraZeneca. I think that could actually change the course of history if we could get businesses on side with this. And I think it's a multi-step process. We're currently pushing for a United Nations resolution on the right to a healthy environment, similar to the resolution on the right to water and sanitation from 2010. But we should also be pushing for an amendment to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, as I mentioned earlier. And having businesses support these initiatives would really dramatically increase their likelihoods of success in the short term.
James, you can be instrumental in changing the course of business. How does that feel?
It's why I get up in the morning. No, that would be really powerful. And look, yeah, very happy to continue that conversation. I think what we've found is about with WBCSD that there are, if you can find 2 or 3 companies that are willing to sort of take that initial step and move into these waters, then that can bring our entire membership along potentially as well. So I think with a few leaders in this space, we can really make a difference, and then expand that out so we can, get some movement going. So look forward to just exploring more.
Fantastic. Dave, I see that David has already put some information in the chat for everybody to click on after this seminar. So that's maybe a very concrete outcome of today. I would also say, for once, we are a few minutes before we ahead of schedule. So please do come with your questions in the chat if you want to for our panelists, because it's a fantastic opportunity. Until they come in, I will continue with a few questions of my own. And Lauren, I would like to ask you. You've listened to what the panelists said before in that panel session. Is there hope for you in these words?
Well, hope is, I guess, kind of a subjective thing. It's often really hard to feel hopeful in the current situation. I am, I guess, inspired by some of the actions that have been outlined, especially that Dr. David Boyd has outlined here, and looking at how human rights can be integrated into ensuring that businesses are operating in a way that ensures a livable future. It is great to see also adults who are willing to listen to youth. And a lot of the time, young people aren't even invited into discussions like these. So that is very uplifting for me personally to be given a platform to speak. I would also like to note the importance of having youth representation, but also of having frontline communities represented. So here in Canada, Indigenous populations and our Indigenous land defenders are doing monumental work to preserve biodiversity. So centering different youth voices is definitely something that I hope to see moving forward, especially youth of color and young women.
Okay, so broadening that perspective and bringing in a kind of a diversity lens on this issue as well, which is very important. And I can assure you that today you have not only spoken at this platform, but you have been heard. With that, I think we will move on and ask the head of external relations and engagement of the Global Child Forum to join us and give a few reflections. He has been listening to this session. Frederik Franke, please join us and give us your impressions, takeaways of the last 1.5 hours.
Thank you, Ruben. Your Majesties, Your Royal Highness, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to close our third Action Lab in Global Child Forum's Action Lab series. As the newest member of the Global Child Forum team, I have found these Action Labs to be very enlightening, helping me to connect my sustainability background with the children's rights agenda. But like many of you, we at Global Child Forum are now challenging ourselves to move beyond enlightenment to action. And we know that climate action is one of those issues that needs our attention. And it's an issue that just can't wait. Last year, to mark Global Child Forum's 10-year anniversary and to acknowledge the 30th anniversary of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, Global Child Forum asked young people around the world what they see as the most critical issues for business to consider in the coming decade. And to answer this question, we commissioned a global survey, scanning opinions from Stockholm to Sao Paulo, to listen and learn from youth so that they could better guide companies along their journey to create a better world for children. And over 2/3 of our youth respondents indicated that they were very concerned about climate change and the environment, and want to see companies making sure their business doesn't affect the environment where children live and play. And over 80% of youth respondents noted that they wanted business to think about how their actions impact children's lives. You can read more about these issues in Global Child Forum's report called 10 Child Rights Issues for Business to Consider, and it's found on our website. And these are the children we want to be accountable to. And this past spring, Global Child Forum put yet another call to youth. This time we asked youth to send photos showing what matters most to them. The result is a beautiful online photo exhibit called Youth Matters. And not surprisingly, given the state of our planet right now, most youth sent in photos of nature. Rezwana sent in a stunning photo showing early morning winter mist over the mountains in Bangladesh. Afnan from Egypt shared a photo of sunlight streaming through trees. And Jacob sent in a photo of a sunset taken in Öland here in Sweden. We want to be accountable to Rezwana, Afnan, and Jacob. And we want to be accountable to the worst children for the planet that they will inherit eventually. And we know that you all will join us in this. And to help, we invite you to visit our website, specifically our knowledge center that we have. There you'll find, for example, our recently released Children's Rights and Business Workbook. It's been mentioned in some of the breakout sessions also. It's a step-by-step guide for companies who want to integrate a children's rights perspective into their daily work. And soon we will also be releasing our next resource, a guide for the corporate sector on how to engage with child participation, also something we've been discussing a lot today. And if you are ready to make a big, bold step, please go ahead and sign the Global Child Forum Pledge, also found on our website. And there we're creating a movement of companies who want to deliver actionable initiatives that contribute to advancing children's rights. And why now? Well, because our planet and our children can't wait. So with those words, I'd like to hand it back over to you, Ruben. But first, I would, on behalf of all of us at the Global Child Forum, like to thank the Royal Family for their continuous support, the speakers here today, of course, for contributing with their expertise and ideas, and of course to Lauren for boldly sharing her views with all of us. And last but not least, all the participants who were attending today. So thank you very much, and over to you, Ruben.
Thank you very much, Fredrik, for those not only inspiring words, but also very concrete tools and tips for companies which they can and should follow. But I have to disappoint you in one matter. You are not closing off today, because I have just been informed that Her Royal Highness, the Crown Princess Victoria, would like to address us again and have a few closing words for all our participants. We go over to Her Royal Highness Crown Princess Victoria.
So I would just like to thank you, all of you, for taking part in today's Action Lab and for showing your interest in this very important matter. So it was a very interesting for me to sit in and listen to you, and I'm thankful for you taking your time today. So thank you all, and I hope to be able to follow your work in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Her Royal Highness, and we appreciate the engagement and commitment of the Royal Court and the Royal Family in this matter very highly, as just stated by Fredrik as well. With that, we end our third Digital Action Lab, but not before I have reminded you and invited you for the last session, the fourth Digital Action Lab, which will take place on November 18th, and which will be under the topic Data Mining in the Sandbox, Children's Safety Online. I hope to see all of you on November 18th. And with that, we log off from Stockholm, and we wish you a very good day for our friends in the west coast of Canada, and evening or night for those of us who are already entering that part of the day. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Ruben.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.